So in November 1979, Ray Leonard had won the WBC welterweight title from Wilfredo Benitez. And there loomed the obvious candidate for a big money fight. And his name was not Roberto Duran. No. Pepino Cuevas. He won the WBA belt in 1976, scoring a TKO over Angel Espada. He defended the belt 11 times, only going the distance with Randy Shields. Cuevas was the longest reigning world champion in that time period and era. A ferocious puncher. Jose Isidro Gonzalez Cuevas from Mexico. I remember being a young dude, left home extremely early. And in the place where I was staying, there was a whole load of boxing there. A couple of boxers used to stay in the crib quite a lot. And they used to tell me stories of Cuevas punching punch bags off the hinge. He hit that hard. And he was a vicious fighter. After Leonard knocked out Dave Boy Green in March 1980, 4th round KO over the Englishman, the groundwork was laid for a unification fight between the two. A deal had actually been reached with the approval of both sanctioning bodies, but this unraveled quickly. Jose Sulaiman, the president of the WBC, implored his countrymen to step aside and pave way for a Duran challenge to Leonard. Don King has always had a cozy, let's just use that word, relationship with the WBC. And a lot of people questioned the WBC's motives in certain decisions that were made concerning King. Leonard and Cuevas would have been a big fight on which King would not have made a single peso. The World Boxing Association, whose title Cuevas held, was based in Duran's home country, and the military government in Panama turned the thumbscrews on a pair of Panamanian nationals. WBA President Rodrigo Sanchez and Elias Cordova, the chairman of the organization's championship committee. Colonel Ruben Paredes, who headed up the National Guard of Panamanian dictator General Omar Torrijos, paid a visit to the WBA office and strongly intimated that it would be in Sanchez's best interests to pull the plug on Leonard and Cuevas. Paredes represented the muscle for Torrijos, whom he would later, albeit briefly, succeed. Torrijos' principal padrone was Carlos Eleta, Duran's influential backer, but the Duran camp denied having exerted undue influence. "We never pressured anyone," insisted Luis Enrique, a Duran advisor who advised as Panama's honorary consul in New York. "On behalf of his people's government," said Enrique, "we merely asked the WBA to do what was right for the sport of boxing and the people of Panama." Boxing history is littered in thuggery, powerful men using their muscle to get their way. An old cynic from the New York press, however, replied on behalf of the New York Daily News, "I would like to say one word. Bullshit." Dick Young said that. Leonard's attorney, Mike Trainer, he recalled that some very influential people wanted to see a Leonard-Duran fight come off before Cuevas. But there were a few obstacles to still overcome. There was no contract, no site, no purse structure, and no promoter. However, Cuevas withdrew from the Leonard fight, citing an injury incurred in his April bout against Harold Volchbrett. Both Leonard and Duran were technically promotional free agents, but Aram, as the promoter of the aborted Leonard-Cuevas fight, could claim some currency with Leonard. King had Eleta's ear and tried to negotiate on Duran's behalf, leaving Trainer convinced that the flamboyant promoter was more concerned about Don King's interests than about Roberto Duran's. Mike Trainer and Bob Arum tried to cut out Don King, flying to Panama to take their case directly to Carlos Eleta, who handled Duran's affairs. But they underestimated King's intelligence. King basically had a strong network in boxing. Very little happened in the world of boxing that King did not know about. He had better spies than the CIA. As they waited to board their flight in the first-class lounge at Kennedy Airport, King, who just happened to be stopping by, joined them. A bizarre conversation ensued in which the rival promoters refused to even acknowledge the other's presence, conducting their discourse between Mike Traynor, who was seated uncomfortably between them. At last, the lawyer had enough. He said, "Look, this is ridiculous," he told them. "There's plenty enough in this for everybody. Either you two guys work this out or I'm going to Panama by myself." King and Arum had both risen to prominence in the sport on the coattails of Muhammad Ali. In 1962, Arum had been dispatched to investigate suspected tax fraud in connection with that year's Sonny Liston-Floyd Patterson rematch, whose ancillary rights were controlled by the notorious conservative lawyer and Bobby Kennedy arch-enemy Roy Cohn. On the night of the bout, Arum had agents waiting to pounce on the box office receipts at every closed-circuit venue in the country. It was a major coup for the young lawyer, who was nonetheless astonished to realize just how much money could be made in boxing. A few years later, after John F. Kennedy's assassination had rendered his future in the Justice Department unpromising, he approached former NFL star and Ali confidant Jim Brown with a suggestion. "Why can't we do what Roy Cohn was doing, but only better?" Jim Brown then brokered an introduction between Ali and Arum, and Arum wound up being the main promoter of Ali's title defense against George Chuvalo in Toronto. This was the first boxing fight that Arum ever attended. When I came to boxing, I was a complete neophyte. A few days later before the fight, I was in a hotel coffee shop when Chuvalo's manager, Irving and Abe Ungerman, sat down and joined me. One of them asked if I thought there was any way their guy could win the fight. I didn't want to let on that I knew nothing about boxing, so I said the only way Chuvalo can beat Ali is to hit him in the balls and to keep hitting him in the balls. Well, the night of the fight, Chuvalo must have hit Ali low a dozen times. Ali won, but afterwards in the dressing room at the Maple Leaf Gardens, he was in absolute agony. I was afraid to confess my part in that. But as I was in there commiserating with him, this balding guy with a microphone shoved his way into the dressing room. I turned around and pointed at him and he said, "You, get the fuck out of here." This was when Arum met Howard Cosell. Arum and Top Rank would go onto stage most, though not all, of Ali's fights in the 70s. During Ali's post-exile comeback, Arum had served as his personal attorney, even for fights he did not promote. Don King, released from prison in September 1971, fast-tracked his way to the top. He promoted an Ali exhibition, which was staged for the benefit of a Cleveland hospital. The show might well have benefited the hospital, but it benefited King considerably more. And in early 1974, he separately approached both Ali and heavyweight George Foreman with promises of then unheard-of purses, $5 million apiece. King came away with contracts bearing the signatures of both boxers. But what he did not have, of course, was $10 million. But that oversight was shortly corrected via a mechanism that would become a hallmark of Don King Promotions. OPM. Other people's money. King's sometime partner, Hank Schwartz, prevailed upon British millionaire investor John Daly to provide some of the cash, hoping to boost tourism in his emerging nation. President Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire dipped into the national treasury for the rest. Thus was born the Rumble in the Jungle. And while his role had been more that of a matchmaker than promoter, King would claim much of the credit. He emerged from Zaire as the veritable face of that epic fight. When 1980 dawned, Ali had retired for the third time, having regained the heavyweight title from Leon Spinks a year earlier. The WBC and WBA titles were vacant. and they were claimed by Ken Norton, the WBC champion, promoted by Don King. John Tate, the WBA champion, promoted by Bob Arum. Both King and Arum were trying to coax Ali out of retirement to challenge their respective title holders, to give legitimacy to their claim. Bob Arum suffered a blow when the obscure and unfancied Mike Weaver, a mile behind in points, came back and knocked out John Tate in the 15th round, taking his WBA belt. This was a disaster for Arum, and it occurred on the same televised card where Sugar Ray Leonard knocked out Britain's Dave Boy Green. King and Arum did join forces again to promote the 1975 Ali-Frazier fight, and they have worked together off and on since, the last time being a couple of weeks ago in March 2018, when King promoted fighter Amir Imam lost a points decision to Jose Ramirez for the vacant WBC title in what was actually an excellent fight. Duran was seeking a $1.5 million guarantee. Negotiations then became very easy. King failed to try and up Duran's guarantee, but he did double the promoter's share he would split with his new partner from $1 million to $2 million. It was almost embarrassing, said Mike Trainer. Duran collected a career-high purse of $1.65 million. Leonard, who in lieu of a purse had taken the site fee, and he took an 80% upside of both the closed circuit and foreign rights television sales, wound up with nearly $10 million. By far the most that any boxer at any weight had ever earned for a single fight. The previous record had been the $6.5 million Ali got for his third fight against Ken Norton. The Quebec Olympic Installation Board was still hurting from the cost of the Olympics 4 years earlier. They came up with a $3.5 million guarantee against the live gate, all of which went to Leonard. The Canadians were basically banking on Leonard's standing in the Olympics 4 years previously, where he won a gold medal at light welter and a Val Barker trophy for being the best boxer, and became a star overnight in Montreal. The fight was scheduled for the 20th of June, 1980. Leonard was 24 years of age, Duran 29. Their combined records were 98-1. The fight was billed as La Face à Face Historique. The 78-seat Stade Olympique was scaled from $500 for ringside seats to $20 tickets in the upper deck, nosebleed sections they called them. Tickets in those denominations moved very quick from the outset. But in the run-up to the fight, sales for the mid-range tickets, priced from $75 to $300, were very disappointing. The bout was formally announced in April at a press conference at New York's Waldorf Astoria. Leonard wore a business suit while Duran was resplendent in jewelry. Leonard sat on one side of the stage, Duran sat on the other. Leonard stared at Duran as he ate. There was fruit on the table. Duran just picked up a grapefruit with his hand and pushed it into his mouth, gnawing his way toward the center. Leonard was taken back. Then came the steak. Ray was politely cutting into his steak, and Duran just jammed the fork into his, picked up the entire steak, and started tearing at it with his teeth, like a hungry lion. Leonard blinked a couple of times and looked away, probably thinking that Duran is an animal. When it came time for Leonard to speak, he tried to prove he was not intimidated by Duran, and he said, "I'm not just going to beat Duran, I'm going to kill him." Duran's trainer, Ray Arcel, said this was a bad choice of words for Leonard to use. Leonard himself said it was uncharacteristic. He said Duran had been pushing his buttons whenever he got close. He cursed at Leonard and shoved him, or acted like he was going to hit Leonard, just showing total disrespect. And Leonard let himself get angry. Duran's trainer, Ray Arcel, said if Leonard had said this to Duran on the street, Mr. Leonard would still be stretched out in the alley. Duran remained in New York for the initial phase of his training, sparring at Gleason's gym with Teddy White and with a young New York pro named Kevin Rooney. who would later distinguish himself as Mike Tyson's trainer. The Duran camp then relocated to Grossinger's resort in the Catskills. Grossinger's was still in its heyday, and it was a tremendous place to train. The food was fabulous, and Duran was an instant hit with the guests and the visiting media. The ski lodge at Grossinger's was closed for the spring, so that became his private training quarters. Duran was focused and serious, so much that it became difficult getting sparring partners to stay in there with him. He was really sharp, said Bobby Goodman, one of Don King's matchmakers. Ray Arcel would come up weekly to check on his progress. But Freddie Brown was in charge of the camp. Brown, who had been in the fight game since the Depression years, he is generally acknowledged to have been the inspiration for Burgess Meredith's razor blade wielding Mickey Goldmill character in Sylvester Stallone's Rocky films. About once a week, Goodman would look out of his window and see Brown, his bag packed, trudging off towards the reception area. This would happen whenever Duran would get out of bed to run, Goodman recalled. Freddie would go to his room and pack his bag. Invariably, you'd then see Duran chasing him across the lawn in his underwear, shouting, "Freddie, don't leave, I run." After several weeks, the instances of Freddie walking out grew less frequent. Duran was now in tremendous shape. I don't think he ever trained this hard for a fight, before or since. Once he hit peak condition, said Goodman, he almost toyed with his sparring partners. Costamato sent Kevin Rooney up to Grossinger's, but Duran just played with Kevin, who was willing and would keep coming but could hardly lay a glove on Duran, as Duran could be a defensive magician when he wanted to. He would just put his gloves on his waist, plant himself right in front of a guy, and they would still have trouble landing clean punches. Ruben Blades, the Harvard-educated salsa singer and band leader, often came up to Grossinger's gym to hang out with Duran. Lou Goldstein, the resort's longtime director of activities, who years earlier had invented a game called Simon Says for the amusement of the guests, would sometimes be joined by Duran for his after-dinner program at the resort. Leonard opted to remain nearer to home. He based his training camp at Sheraton in New Carrollton, Maryland, just off the Capitol Betway. He did his morning road work at nearby Greenbelt Park. He didn't exactly splurge on sparring partners using Don Morgan, a journeyman welterweight who had made a career of losing to bigger name opponents, and a local amateur named Mike James. Roger Leonard, the champion's somewhat less talented older brother, and Odell Leonard, who identified himself as Ray's cousin, also shared time in the New Carrollton ring. Odell was not my cousin, recalled Ray. His name was Odell Davis, and he showed up at the gym in Palmer Park one day with a mohawk haircut, saying, "Where's Sugar Ray Leonard? I'ma kill him." He started hanging around the gym and became a sort of fixture there. One day he asked about the people my family had known in North Carolina, and then he said, "We must kind of be cousins." And Ray said, "Whatever." But Odell started getting fights just by saying his name was Odell Leonard. At the champion's request, the sparring partners all wore t-shirts with Duran stenciled across the front. "I have a tendency to ease up when I spar," said Leonard. "But when I see that name, I want to tear the other guy's head off." A few weeks before the fight, publicist Charlie Brotman arranged an open workout. Sports writers from up and down the East Coast were invited to come in and watch Leonard spar and engage in question and answer sessions afterwards. It was there that Didinger asked Leonard if he'd ever reflected on how things might have gone had he been able to stick to his original plan after the Olympics and never turned pro. "I'd still be under pressure, but a different kind," he told Didinger. "I'd be a senior at the University of Maryland, getting ready to take my final exams and wondering what I was doing after graduation. I'd be playing old Ray Leonard again. And I wouldn't have to worry about looking at Roberto Duran's ugly face next week." Apparently unpersuaded that Duran's knockout prowess had travelled with him to the 147 division, the odds makers posted Duran as a 9-5 favourite. A preponderance of boxing experts shared that view. In a June issue that featured two boxers on its cover, Inside Sports polled a select panel of insiders: Muhammad Ali, Gil Clancy, Sugar Ray Robinson, Jimmy Jacobs, Red Smith, Bert Sugar, Edwin Verrett, who had gone the distance with Leonard and Duran. All picked Sugar Ray to win. Howard Letterman, he picked Duran, albeit for the wrong reasons. He said it would get Leonard late, while Customato was it would turn out pretty much right on the money. If Duran has the will to apply his skills with determination and courage, he would neutralize Leonard's ability. The final tally favoured Leonard by a 7-2 margin with one abstention. The 10th member of the Inside Sports panel, Arthur McCante, still hoping that he might be named the referee, declined to pick a winner. "The casting is perfect," said Angelo Dundee. "You have Sugar Ray, the kid next door, the guy in the white hat against Duran the killer, the guy with the gunfighter's eyes. It's the kind of fight where you can't be neutral." While the fighters were still in training camp, King dispatched Bobby Goodman to Montreal for a site survey. In the custom line at the airport, he was surprised to run into Aram. "When are Teddy and I going to get together on the matches?" Goodman inquired. The Leonard-Duran fight was an Aram and King co-promotion, and he had expected his matchmaking counterpart, Top Rank's Teddy Brenner, to share the duty of putting together the undercard. "The card's already been made," replied Aram. Goodman was somewhat taken back. When he voiced his objection, Aram replied, "That's too bad. If Don had a problem, we'll go to arbitration, and the guy handling that is Mike Trainer." Goodman interpreted Aram's undercard coup as a declaration of war. Brenner, hoping for a win that would put John Tate back in line for another world title shot, had matched the former WBA champion against the Canadian heavyweight champion Trevor Berbick. So he reached out for Berbick, set him up in a training camp, and got him some great sparring to get him ready for an upset over Aram's contender, recalled Goodman. A month before the fight, Duran began experiencing severe back spasms, and a specialist was summoned to Grossinger's. Members of the camp were sworn to secrecy, but the condition was bad enough that Luis Enrique was seriously contemplating to ask for a postponement. In February 1980, 3 months after the draw with Vito Antuofermo, Hagler was matched with middleweight contender Lucif Hamani at the Cumberland County Civic Center in Portland, Maine. Hamani was a Paris-based Algerian with a 20-1 record, but he had never fought in the United States, nor had he faced an opponent of Hagler's caliber. Hagler knocked him out in 2. Hagler also got the opportunity to avenge his first career defeat against Boogaloo Watts 2 months later. Once again, the bout took place in Portland, and once again it didn't get out of the second round. In May, he fought Marcus Giraldo in Las Vegas. The Mexican had given Leonard a world of trouble when they fought in Baton Rouge a year earlier, and Hagler had his problems as well. But he did enough to win 7 of the 10 rounds on the scorecards of all 3 judges. Hearns also kept himself busy. In February, he traveled to Las Vegas, where he knocked out fighting Jim Richards on the Larry Holmes Lorenzo Zanin undercard. A month later, he was back in Detroit to fight Angel Espada, a former WBA welterweight champion, in the main event of a card at the Joe Louis Arena. Hearns stopped Espada in 4. In that evening's co-feature, Hill McKenty stopped WBA lightweight champion Esterno Espana in 9 to become Emmanuel Stewart's first world champion. On the 31st of March, the same night, Leonard knocked out Dave Boy Green at the Cap Center. Hearns knocked out Santiago Valdez at Caesars Palace. Employing a split feed from the separate venues, ABC had shown title bouts originating in Landover, Knoxville, and Las Vegas. Hearns versus Santiago had been part of the Larry Holmes Leroy Jones card at the latter venue, but was not included on the telecast. In May, the Hitman returned to Detroit to fight Eddie Garzo at Cobo Hall. Garzo, from Nicaragua, had just a few years earlier held the WBA Junior Middleweight Championship. At that time, he may have been the worst champion in history, claimed Michael Katz. Hearns knocked him out in the first round. The Hitman was now 28-0, His next fight, scheduled for later that summer, would be against Pepino Cuevas for the WBA welterweight title. Duran arrived in Montreal a few days later before Leonard did, and polished off his sparring at the Complex des Jardins. The assumption had been that Leonard would have retained his popularity amongst the locals who remembered him from the 1976 games. But Duran, who wore a t-shirt saying Bonjour Montreal at his workouts, quickly captured the hearts of the Quebecans. The boxers worked out in the same ring at Desjardins. The gym had been converted from an old ice hockey rink. In one of the sparring sessions, Leonard floored Mike James with a right hand. It was observed by a journalist that Duran skipped rope like a drunk. In a Cleveland gym, I once saw a similar display of ineptitude. Duran continually getting tangled up in the jump rope. Since skipping rope is universally one of the very first exercises a boxer learns, this also struck me as a pretty startling revelation. Michael Katz, a sports writer, he insisted that if Duran wanted to skip rope, he could do, and he was pretending and imitating to be a drunk man. But Duran's punch power in them sparring sessions was very impressive. Picture perfect is how one journalist described it. He sparred and trained with a whole load of exuberance. He was so full of energy and seemed to really enjoy what he was doing. I was at the gym one day, and when he finished, he was ready to leap right out of the ring. The ring was a good 4 or 5 feet off the floor, so this absolutely terrified Ray Arcel and Freddie Brown, who seemed to be watching over Duran every second. Arcel was old, and he could move pretty fast. He raced over and helped Duran down from the ring to make sure he didn't jump and turn an ankle or something. Angelo Dundee, who would turn 60 a year after the Montreal fight, said Arcel and Freddie Brown are older than water, although Angelo was no spring chicken himself. Angelo had learnt many tricks of the trade as a young cornerman on the New York boxing scene in the late 40s. Arcel, his experience went back to the days of Benny Leonard. Freddie Brown could also claim a lengthy boxing pedigree in Marciano's corner a generation earlier. Brown had acquired a degree of immortality as the cutman who stemmed the damage on Rocky's nose in his second bout with Ezra Charles, and that was one serious cut. Duran and his boisterous travelling party were booked into the Stade Hotel Bonaventure. Leonard and his crew, once they arrived in Montreal, took up residence nearby at the more modern Le Regence Hyatt. The hotel where Team Leonard stayed was a far cry from the Leonard family accommodations in Montreal during the 1976 Olympic Games. Of course, Ray had stayed in the Olympic Village, but his parents, Cicero and Getha, and wife-to-be Juanita, Dave Jacobs, and several of Leonard's brothers and sisters had driven to Canada together in a beat-up Volkswagen they nicknamed the Sardine. The ladies shared a single room in a budget motel, sleeping on beds, chairs, and the floor. Jacob, Cicero, Roger, and Kenny slept in the Sardine, which was parked on the street nearby, and occasionally snuck in the motel to catch a quick shower. But now, in 1980, Duran and Leonard's respective headquarters were only a few blocks apart, and it was inevitable that there would be a chance encounter in the days leading up to the fight. Duran might not have spoken much English back then, but that didn't mean he couldn't give Leonard the finger whenever he saw him. One morning, Leonard's sister Sharon was walking down the street when she looked up and saw Duran leering at her from a passing car, flashing a message that did not require an interpreter. Once his wife even gave my wife the finger, said Leonard. The show of machismo took its toll on Sugar Ray. Dundee would later admit to the New York Times that Leonard got out-psyched. Duran abused Ray, and Ray could not handle it. Duran would see Ray walking with his wife in the streets in Montreal, and he'd yell, "I'll kill your husband, I'll kill your husband." The night of the fight, Ray wanted to kill him. Ray wanted to fight the guy, not boxing. 27 years later, Ray conceded that Duran done a masterful job of winding him up. "I don't think it was calculated," said Duran. "It was more a case of Duran being Duran. He had that bully's mentality, and he always tried to intimidate opponents. But he did challenge my manhood, and I wasn't mature enough to know how to respond. All I could think about was retaliating." Duran's hotel lobby was filled with Panamanian militiamen, zealously guarding Duran and swatting away any hotel guests who might venture too near. Duran spotted a journalist named Michael Katz across the room, and shooing away his protectors, walked over and hugged him. The two chatted for a moment. As they parted ways, Duran winked at Katz and told him, "I hope you bet big on me." And Katz, aka the Wolfman, he did bet on Duran. The boxers reported to the Quebec Commission officers on Monday for their pre-fight physicals. Shortly thereafter, Arcel got a phone call in his hotel room informing him that Duran's ECG had revealed an irregularity, an unexplained arrhythmia, and that the fight might now be in jeopardy. "How can Duran have a heart condition?" asked Arcel. "Duran doesn't even have a heart." The next morning, Duran underwent a 4-hour battery of tests at the Montreal Institute of Cardiology and was cleared to fight. The cause of the irregularity on the initial ECG was never confirmed, but it was widely speculated that it could be precipitated by diet pills that Duran had consumed in a frenetic attempt to shed extra poundage in the days before the fight. Leonard weighed in at 145 and Duran was just half a pound heavier. In retrospect, Leonard said he probably came in too light for the fight. Jose Sullivan, the WBC president, who Bob Arum once described as a fat Mexican dictator, had elected to stay at the same hotel as Leonard. Sullivan had further enraged the Duran camp when he appointed Carlos Padilla as the referee. It had been Padilla who, the previous November, had intervened to stop Leonard's fight against Benitez with 6 seconds left in the final round, and more recently, Padilla had appeared somewhat squeamish in working the first Alaminta Vito Antuofermo fight. In the opinion of Brown, who had been in Antuofermo's corner, the referee's disinclination to let Antuofermo work inside had cost his man the title. Brown also complained that whenever Antuofermo worked his way inside Minta's jab, the Englishman would grab him, and when Vito continued to punch with his free hand, the referee would break the fighters. "I want a referee that will let my fighter fight," moaned Ray Arcel at the weigh-in. Arcel made it a point to lecture the Filipino referee. Arcel plainly hoped to gain an advantage for Duran when he reminded Padilla that the customers had paid to see 2 boxers, not him. "Give us a great fight," he told the referee. "Let the 2 men fight." The night before the fight, several of us were having a drink when Jose Sullivan sat down and joined us, recalled Michael Katz. He told us that night that he had instructed Padilla to let the fighters fight. "I think this had a lot more to do with the conduct of the fight than anything," Ray Arcel might have said to the referee. Disappointingly, the stadium was only filled to half its capacity, and the promoters were banking on a walk-up crowd to turn up late, but it had rained all afternoon and the drizzle continued into the evening when the first preliminary bout started. In its original concept, Stade Olympique was to have a retractable domed roof which would be opened and closed by cables suspended from a 500-plus foot tower. On the drawing board, the roof resembled the lid of a giant teapot. Inhospitable weather, a protracted labour dispute, and engineering foul-ups had delayed its completion, and the 1976 Olympics had taken place in the open air. The tower remained, but 4 years later, the 60,000 square foot roof was still in Paris. The roof would not be installed until 1986. In 1991 it collapsed, raining 55 tons of concrete into the fortunately unoccupied interior. The cost of the stadium had initially been estimated at $120 million, but by the time the Expos fled to Washington in 2006, the figure topped to $1 billion. And 8% of the price of each pack of cigarettes purchased in Quebec was going to defray the debt service from an Olympiad held 3 decades earlier. The fact that the roof was still not in place for the Duran-Leonard fight proved a boon for those who had purchased tickets in the cheap seats, most of which were protected from the elements, but the ring had been set up in the baseball infield between the pitcher's mound and second base, meaning the prime-time ringside seats were at field level and fully exposed. The ushers in the $500 sections walked around dispensing ponchos. When they ran out of those, they distributed plastic rubbish bags for the high rollers to wear over their clothes. The paid attendance would eventually reach 46,195. Had the Expos been able to draw such numbers, they would still be in Montreal today. I did a little research. The Expos are, or were, or used to play in the stadium. They're a baseball team. But on this evening, it translated into nearly 32,000 empty seats. Far from recouping its investment, the Quebec Olympic Installation Board would be driven even further into the hole. The ringside press seats were also exposed to the elements, and many of us watched the undercard from beneath the roof in the stands above the first baseline. Others watched from the comfort of the Expos press room. Tragedy would hit the proceedings in the second bout of the evening. A rubber match between lightweights Cleveland Denny and Gaetan Hart, who had split 2 earlier meetings. In the final minute of their 10-round bout, Hart rained a succession of unanswered blows to the head of Denny. Far too late, the Canadian referee, Rosario Belegian, tried to stop the fight, but even in his belated intervention, he was hopelessly out of position. Belegian stood behind Hart, frantically waving his arms, while Hart was unable to see the referee. Belegian stood behind Hart, frantically waving his arms, while Hart, unable to see the referee, kept pounding away at Denny. Once Hart was pulled away, Denny keeled over, his head thumping off the canvas. For several minutes he lay there, as chaos reigned in the ring. The moment remains etched in Leonard Gardner's mind. "I'd never seen anyone die in a ring before. Though I've seen it since," said Gardner. "It seemed apparent that had happened. Even at the time, Denny seemed to change colour before my eyes. He looked like he was turning grey. It was a weird thing to see, or to think you've seen." Eventually a stretcher was summoned, Denny still convulsing. They strapped him into the stretcher and wheeled him away from the ring. By then, Michael Katz and I had made our way back down to ringside. As we looked at Denny on the gurney, Denny's eyes rolled back into his head, his eyes evincing only white, and his gum shield was still clenched between his teeth. I think we both knew right there he wasn't going to make it. This is what Mike Katz recalled a quarter of a century later. "You've got to get the mouthpiece out," I told one of the paramedics. A familiar face emerged from the mob surrounding Denny. "I've been trying for the last 10 minutes, said a wary Ferdy Pacheco. The fight doctor, scheduled to work as part of the broadcast team, had followed his instincts and his Hippocratic oath, abandoning his TV position to assist the stricken boxer. Somebody from the Boston Herald American, Tim Horgan, had been assigned to write the Duran-Leonard lead that night. Now, what appeared to have been a preventable tragedy might also be an important story. After quickly conferring with Horgan, I jumped into a cab and followed the ambulance to Mesa Nova Rosemont Hospital. Denny was scheduled for immediate surgery to relieve a subdural hematoma, but no other information seemed to be forthcoming. Denny's wife, Clarine, had accompanied him to the hospital, but less than an hour later, on the advice of the hospital staff, she summoned another cab and returned to the stadium. "Well, if she's going back to the fight, then I'm going back to the fight," I reasoned. Denny would linger for nearly 2 weeks. His brainstem had probably herniated. When he hit the floor, he was pronounced clinically dead on the 2nd of July, but his wife elected not to remove him from life support systems, opting to rely on prayer. He lasted 5 more days before he died on the 7th of July. In my absence, a pair of Canadian middleweights, Eddie Mello and Fernand Makote, had battled to a 10-round draw, but I got back in time to see the conclusion of the semi-final, which on another night might have provided comic relief. In what was supposed to be the first step up in the rehabilitation of John Tate, Aram had matched him against the Canadian heavyweight champion Trevor Berbick, fighting in the same city where he had been ingloriously knocked out by Teofilo Stevenson in their Olympic semi-final 4 years earlier. Tate more than held his own for 8 rounds, but in the 9th, Berbick caught him with a big right hand, and Tate responded by turning his back and literally running away. As Tate fled across the ring, Berbick chased him, still throwing punches, the last of which caught the American on the back of his head and knocked him headfirst through the ropes, landing with a belly flop on the canvas. The only perceptible movement from Tate came in the involuntary twitching of his legs, and in that instant it crossed more than one person's mind that we may have been looking at 2 fatalities in one night. Tate landed almost directly in front of Bob Arum, remembered Mike Katz. Arum had a look of shock on his face, and even as the referee was counting, I could hear the unmistakable "ha ha ha" of Don King cackling from across the ring. I looked over at Don. "Don't tell me you've got Berbick too." King enthusiastically nodded his head and said, "Yes, he did." Duran, the first of the main event competitors to make an appearance, seemed eager to fight that he almost raced from the dugout to the ring, accompanied by the beat of drums. When Leonard approached center stage, his wife and sister climbed the top of their chairs, dancing as they sing, "Hey, Sugar Ray." I also seem to recall that once they reached the ring, the principals were forced to stand through 3 different national anthems, plus a rendition of "O Canada," which was quite a regular thing to happen in Montreal. This turned into a contest between the French and English-speaking segments of the crowd, each trying to drown out the other by singing in its preferred tongue. As the boxers were introduced, another division of loyalties became evident. Despite his history in the venue, Leonard was far from an overwhelming crowd favorite. The cheers for Duran were even more pronounced, and boos and whistles could be heard amid the applause that greeted Leonard's name. Leonard, for possibly the first time in his career, was even outswaggered. Duran exuded confidence. Leonard, despite a nervous smile, looked like a man about to face a firing squad. "This was a big fight, bigger than anything I'd ever experienced before," said Leonard. "I can remember looking around at all those people in the stadium, looking at myself on the big TV screen and thinking, wow, this is huge." I was in awe from the sheer magnitude of the event. Everybody thought Leonard would have the hand speed and ring quickness advantage over Duran, but that became a moot point. For much of the night, Leonard tried to beat Duran at his own game. The tone for the evening was set at the opening bell, when Duran charged straight out of his corner and tried to hit Leonard in the balls with the first punch he threw. Duran spent most of the opening 3 minutes trying to bull his way around the ring, and Leonard spent most of it trying to shake his way clear. Duran landed the best punch of the round when he speared Leonard with a right-hand lead, and Leonard responded by shaking his head to indicate that he had not been hurt. When a fighter does that, it's usually a safe bet that he has been hurt. In the second, Duran caught Leonard high on the head with a left uppercut that knocked him backwards into the ropes. Stunned, Ray tried to clinch, but even as he grappled and looked to the referee for help, Duran kept pounding away. Ray said when starting out, he had given some head movement and a few little feints, but then Duran caught me with an uppercut and just knocked the shit out of me, said Leonard. Katz recalled the same punch as a right-hand lead. The shock to me was that Duran had hands as quick as Leonard, said the Wolfman. Ray was hurt by that punch, and he didn't recover for rounds. Before the fight, Dundee had predicted that the key will be Ray's left hand, but Leonard had not shown that weapon. On the other hand, I showed I could take a punch, said Leonard. Duran continued to punish the champion over the next 2, pounding Leonard with solid rights, and while Leonard sometimes landed spectacular flurries of punches, he spent much of the evening allowing himself to be pushed around the ring. Although he had been expected to set the tone with his jab, Leonard failed to establish a rhythm, and when he tried to go on the attack, Duran was able to rely on his superior counterpunching. The Leonard camp would complain that Padilla, with perhaps Sullivan's pre-fight admonition ringing in his ear, had abetted Duran's roughhousing by allowing him to escape unpunished when he held and hit, or used his elbows and forearms to maneuver Leonard around the ring. From the corner, Dundee recalled those early stanzas 2 decades later. Manos de Piedra told his biographer, Christian Guidas, that Leonard, or perhaps Dundee, had committed a tactical blunder by smearing his body with Vaseline. The theory had been that the ample coating of grease would cause Duran's punches to slide off, but by the 4th, the substance had been transmitted to Duran's gloves. When Leonard tried to tie him up, which was often, Duran was able to yank his hands free and resume his attack. Although He was ostensibly the quicker man. Leonard already had rope burns on his back from the numerous occasions Duran had driven him to the edge of the ring. Ray was no longer even trying to dance. In her ringside seat, Juanita Leonard had begun to sob. Leonard finally sprung into action in the fifth, unleashing dazzling combinations of punches that impressed the judges, if not his opponent. I couldn't tell you why, Leonard said of the abrupt change in approach beginning with the fifth. I think my fighting instincts just took over. Duran disdainfully sneered in his response, but when it was over, it was clear that Sugar Ray Leonard had claimed his first round. In round 6, Leonard once again became the aggressor, using his jab to set up combinations. Now Ray was forcing Duran to tie him up. By then I felt I was in control of the fight, Leonard recalled to his Boswell, Al Goldstein. But the one thing that concerned me was Duran's head. He was using it as a weapon. Every time I moved inside, he tried to butt me. By the 7th, the fight had turned into an all-out street war. And by the time it ended, both men looked so tired that it was hard to imagine the fight lasting 8 more. I thought Duran had probably won the round, but all 3 judges scored it even. As the two engaged in a toe-to-toe brawl in the 8th, stadium ushers rushed to Juanita's ringside seat. Overcome by the intensity of what she was watching, Ray's wife had fainted. Dave Jacobs, working the corner with Dundee and Janks Morton, looked as if he was about to pass out himself. "Box," he kept pleading. "Be the boss," Arcel ordered Duran. The 9th round produced another vintage Duran move. He charged into Leonard, butted him squarely in the forehead, and then, as Ray clinched, raked his head across his eyes. Leonard, once he extricated himself, wiped himself with his glove to check for blood. Once again, all 3 judges scored an even round. Leonard showed tremendous courage. An admiring Arcel would say later, Duran landed some body shots that would have shook Hitler's army, but Leonard kept fighting back. The 10th was on the way to being another close round, until Leonard clocked Duran with his best punch of the night, an overhand right that came out of nowhere and rocked the Panamanian in his tracks. The 11th was another non-stop 3-minute brawl. Leonard, who opened with a right-hand lead, followed by a staccato flurry to the body, probably did enough to win it. But Duran fired back and was battling back by the end of the round, setting the stage for the 12th, in which Duran would win his last round of the fight. The 13th proved to be Leonard's most dominant stanza of the evening, as he dug into Duran with a left to the body, followed by 2 rights to the head. Later in the round, the second half of a left-right combination snapped Duran's head backwards. Leonard continued to jar Duran with combinations in the penultimate round, but the challenger countered by putting his head down and charging forward to tackle Ray in an effort to smother the onslaught. From the corner, Angelo Dundee shouted, "Why don't you break him, Padilla? Why don't you break him?" Sugar Ray closed the show with a dazzling final round that impressed all but Duran, who played to the crowd, mocking his opponent, apparently confident of victory. Duran did a little Leonard-esque dance and pointed to his chin, daring Leonard to hit him one more time. When the final bell sounded, Leonard reached out and tried to tap Duran with his glove, but Cholo appeared to ignore the gesture. Both boxers were quickly engulfed in a mass of humanity as cornermen, posers, and officials poured into the ring. When Duran reached his corner, I saw him suddenly wheel and, pointing to his own genitals, unleash an incomprehensible torrent in Spanish. "What did Roberto say?" I asked my pal Jose Torres, the former light heavyweight champion. He called him a pussy," said Torres, "a cunt." Leonard Gardner seemed to think that Duran was addressing his remarks to Wilfredo Benitez, while my own impression was that he had been looking right at Sugar Ray when he did it. As it turned out, we were both wrong. The gesture was aimed at Roger Leonard. Right after the bell, Roger came charging out of the corner, running straight at Duran, said Ray. Duran responded pretty much the way he responded to Pedro Mendoza's wife and dropped Roger in his tracks with a single punch. Duran just nailed him, said Ray. There was so much confusion in the ring that not a lot of people even saw it happen. Benitez was, however, a conspicuous presence at ringside. He had been invited by Howard Cosell to sit in on the telecast. Leonard Gardner, however, said that Benitez abandoned his post to yell insults at Duran. A security guard picked him up and was about to throw him over the ropes into the press section, where I convinced him that Wilfredo was a valuable commodity. wrote Gardner in recapturing the moment. An eerie silence pervaded the stadium while the verdict was awaited. Sugar Ray Leonard had closed the show, but now the unthinkable had begun to cross his mind, the possibility that he may have lost. They both seemed to be blocking and slipping and rolling and countering. Many people thought it was an evenly contested fight. In the initial reading of the scorecards, the French judge, Raymond Balderou, had it 146, 144 for Duran. The Italian judge, Angelo Paletti, scored the fight even at 147, 147. For a brief instant, it appeared that a fight this close might come to a split draw. But then came the British judge's card, Harry Gibbs. He scored it 145, Duran, 144, Leonard, rendering it a majority decision. Though clearly disappointed, Ray didn't complain about the verdict. In his dressing room, he conceded that Duran had won most of the early rounds, in which he termed the hardest fight of his career, but pointed out that once he got uncracked, I stood my ground. You never fight to a guy's strengths, you try to offset it, sighed Dundee, as he attempted to explain to Sports Illustrated's Bill Knack how the best laid plan had gone awry. It was strictly Duran stuff, elbows, knees, head to the face. The guy who had more practice at that won the fight. An hour later, Bob Lee, back then a WBC supervisor, entered the press room to sheepishly announce that there had been a mistake in the tabulation of the scorecards and that Paletti actually had it 148-147 for Duran. While that made the decision unanimous, the 1-point correction did not alter the outcome, but it made it all the more outrageous in that it confirmed that Paletti, who had flown from Italy to Canada on the promoter's dime because of his alleged boxing expertise, had scored 10 rounds of a 15-round fight even. It was a cop-out so infuriating that even his fellow judges condemned him. Calling 10 rounds of a fight even is a diabolical disgrace, said Gibbs, although in truth, none of the judges that night was particularly decisive. Between them, they scored 18 of a possible 45 rounds even. It was a great fight, and it was a shame that either fighter had to lose, is what Bobby Goodman recalled 27 years later. The way Red Smith put it, it was very fitting. Tonight the man became a legend, and the boy became a man. But ultimately, Leonard had lost for essentially the same reason Marvin Hagler would lose to him 7 years later. Sugar Ray had allowed his adversary to dictate the terms under which the battle was waged. He had fought Duran's fight. Why had Leonard allowed himself to be drawn into a battle for which he was ill-suited? Hard to think when you're getting your brains knocked out, supposed Freddie Brown. This ain't football, you know? And Duran is like Marciano. He never gives you the ball. Like Hagler, who described his alter ego as the Monster, and Hearns the Hitman, Sugar Ray Leonard. He referred to himself in the third person, the Street Fighter. The Street Fighter was always lurking there somewhere inside me. I always knew I could hang with anyone, any size, when it came down to inside fighting, reflected Leonard. Normally, the Street Fighter doesn't come out because he's controlled. But in this fight, I just lost and it took over. Having repaired to his dressing quarters, Duran brandished his gaudy new WBC championship belt. Then he looked across the room to Brown and said, tears glistening in his eyes, "Freddie, you deserve this," and handed it to the grizzly old trainer. When the first wave of press arrived, the new champion was asked what had made the difference in the fight. Duran responded by pounding on the left side of his chest to indicate corazon. Was he suggesting that Leonard had lacked heart? No, Duran replied for an interpreter. If Leonard did not have a heart, he would not be alive tonight. To my mind, said Michael Katz, what happened in Montreal that night was one of the greatest displays of athletic heroism I've ever witnessed. Roberto Duran beat a man who was bigger, stronger, younger, faster, and just plain better, with willpower. It was an incredible performance. After the fight, Leonard said he was contemplating retirement, or serious about considering it anyway. He confirmed many years later it had nothing to do with the decision. I just didn't like the fact that I'd lost. But I wasn't demoralized the way the rest of the guys were. Janks, Dave, even Angelo were devastated. Mike Trainer was so crushed that I don't think he even came into the dressing room. Elsewhere in the stadium, Trainer told Bill Knack, as far as I'm concerned, Ray can pack it in. By winning a world title, Leonard had accomplished what he set out to do, said trainer. I don't enjoy this. I don't enjoy seeing him getting hit. I was mentally and physically exhausted, Ray recalled. I've never taken such a physical beating. The doctor had come up to my hotel room later that night, draining blood from my ears. It was one of the most physically demanding challenges of my life. But the thing people had always wondered about was whether I could take a shot. I never had to before. Although he went 1-for-1 for the evening, Roger Leonard was the only Leonard to win a fight that night before getting KO'd. He had outpointed Clyde Gray, the 33-year-old former Canadian welterweight champion, who had, in the space of 8 months the previous year, been knocked out by Tommy Hearns, Pete Ranzani, and Chris Clark. Despite being embarrassed in the post-fight skirmish with Duran, Roger excitedly proclaimed that he would avenge the family honor. I want Duran next, he would tell anyone who would listen. Roger, Dave Jacobs said wearily, shut up.